Dr. Andri Magnason is an Icelandic writer. He has written novels, poetry, plays, short stories, and essays. He's also director and producer of 3 documentary films. His work has been published or performed in more than 40 countries, and he's been described as the love child of Noam Chomsky and Lewis Carroll. Please welcome Dr. Andri Magnason.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here in Chautauqua. I hope you all hear me very well. I'm the only member of my family that's not a doctor. My father's a doctor, my grandfather, my sister, but I studied Icelandic literature. But it's okay, I'll just keep the honor. So how many of you were at the lecture yesterday? So quite a lot of you, yeah, because I don't want to tell the same story again. So, but there might be some crossovers and more deeply related to the science factor of it. So the question that we're dealing with is like, what is the role of an artist? What can a poet, writer, children's books writer, what can I contribute to science, a field that I don't maybe have any knowledge of or speciality in. And like I told you yesterday, I met a climate scientist in Potsdam in Germany, but I also met Icelandic ocean scientists and glacial scientists, and they asked me, why don't you write about climate change? And I tell them, I'm not a scientist, I don't have authority. I might make a fool of myself if I start writing about something. And then I was a bit illusioned by maybe the media that was presenting the case as a 50-50 issue. So you would have maybe on one hand in the media, a member of some big scientific institution, NASA or something, with 1,000 years of papers behind them. And then you would have a blogger on the other hand, and he would like say, no, I think that scientist is wrong because I just don't feel like it's colder now or warmer now, or just, you know, and it would always be presented, and this illusion of the media is presenting things always as a 50-50 thing when one member would only be presenting like only a portion of it. So I intended to go into science, so I was in some kind of scientific branch of college, and I went to medicine for 1 year before I switched to Icelandic literature, and I did get the opportunity when I was working in the archives here with medieval scientists. I did have the opportunity to go to the Amazon and work with my uncle. His name was John Thorbjarnarsson, and he was a specialist in crocodiles. So he invited me to come and help him do the primal research on the mating habits of the anaconda snake. So we were supposed to go through the swamplands in some ranches in Venezuela, and we would see a lump somewhere in the water, and we were supposed to wade into that water, and we were supposed to drag our feet because the bottom was full of stingrays or electric eels that would, so you had to push your feet, and then we were supposed to wrestle the snakes, not alone, but 2 or 3 at a time, put them in a bag and drive them to the local maternity ward, where they would ultrasound them and see how many snakelings, or what you call them, were inside. So this was, of course, and then after that we were going to go to Mamirao, which is a reserve in the Amazon, where he was doing studies and a project of sustainable management of the Cayman crocodile, which is the biggest crocodile biggest predator in South America. And there we were supposed to go on canoes into the waters, snare the caiman like he's doing here, and put some markings on his scales, and release them again. So he was kind of trying to find the mating, the breeding grounds, and then we were supposed to go and count some eggs. So of course I was 23 years old, and this is something that you want to do when you're 23 years old. But then I had this crocodile here coming, and so we were expecting a child, me and my wife, and it's or my girlfriend at the time, my wife now. And it's not the first thing you do is to say, "Toodaloo, I'm off to the Amazon to wrestle snakes." But of course, this was more scary than the snakes, having a first child. So my path diverged there. I would maybe have gone into biology and of course this childhood dream of watching Attenborough documentaries and marine biology. So my kind of head was kind of there, but I went into this direction. So I went into storytelling, folklore, and poetry, and this world kind of caught me. And this was also thrilling, and it's of course strange to. So I was handling this book every single day when I was putting it on display. And the medieval scientists in Iceland, they're not very good at marketing. So they had a museum or they had an exhibition, but they didn't let anybody know that the exhibition was open. So I was alone sitting with this manuscript every day for this summer, regretting not being in the Amazon. But of course, in hindsight, it was a privilege as well, because this is the primal source of Norse mythology. This is the manuscript that inspired Tolkien, Wagner, Borges. This is like, like Mona Lisa is important, but it's not like we have every single year a new Marvel Comics movie coming out of Mona Lisa. But this manuscript, and I was kind of thrilled by mythology, and you could almost say it's almost like the mythology is almost like, it almost has like the periodic table of language, you could say. So it's very scarce. It's not flowered, the language. It's just like, it almost uses only these primal words in the periodic table of language, which doesn't exist, but maybe exists somewhere. So it's basically one small sentence in this book might be something, just the description of Valhalla is like, there is a house, it has 600 doors, and it doesn't say it like in more words than that, but just saying that Valhalla was a house, it has 600 doors, that just, it blows up imagination for artists later on. So here you can read this here, or you can't, I can read it, but I can actually help you read it. So Sigurður, it's a man's name. Tók, it's the same as took. Fáfnis, it's the dragon, Fáfnir. Sigurður tók Fáfnis hjarta. You know what hjarta is? Heart. So Sigurður tók Fáfnis hjarta og steikti á teini. Hann hugði að fullsteikt væri og þveitun úr hjartanu, þá tók hann á fingri sínum og bragðaði hvort fullsteikt væri. Fullsteikt is fully staked, fully cooked. So Siegfried took the heart of the dragon and it roasted it on a fire, and the blood was kind of bubbling out of the meat, and he tasted it with his finger. He tasted the blood with his finger to see if it was well done or medium rare. And when the blood came on his tongue, he could understand bird language. So this you can see reproduced in the Nibelungen ring. So I was kind of starstruck to see, like, wow, this is something somebody wrote 1200 by a memory, maybe since who knows when, like since the 300, 400, 500. And I am reading this in close to the year 2000. So I got this strong feeling of time. And then what was even more thrilling was in the archives, in the same institute, they had recordings of old women that were reciting rhymes and lullabies and songs that they learned from their grandmothers, that they learned from their grandmothers, that they learned from their grandmothers. So it was putting these headphones on my ears every morning in this summer because I was kind of looking for treasures in that to publish as a CD. Yeah.
Garður Gunnarsson, Gunnar Hrafnsson, Refur Ráðbeinsson, Ráðfinnur Kolsson, Kolur Kjörvaldsson, Kjörvaldur Bjórsson, Bjór Brettingsson, Brettingur Hakason, Haki Óðinsson, Óðinn kongur allra trölla faðir.
So these lullabies were like thousands of hours, and Iceland was extremely isolated for 1,000 years. So we only had a few ships every year that came to Iceland, and therefore the culture became very locally and like locally within Iceland, but also Iceland itself became very isolated. So we had branches of medieval culture that kind of went to Iceland, stranded there, and evolved for like 600 years into special literary categories. So I was thrilled listening to this, and I was listening to these old women, and I was thinking, this woman was singing a song that she learned from her grandmother that was born 1822, that she learned from her grandmother that was born 1785. So just through one single woman, I was like listening to an echo of 1700 something. So I got really obsessed with this, how something goes from being common and every man's knowledge, every man's culture, to becoming scarce, to becoming rare, until we have folklorists driving full speed in northern Iceland to catch this last old lady that knows a fragment of this most common song of the 1850s, until they find out that she just had a stroke the day before, and the song was lost forever. And I was also thrilled by the culture of that time, where every generation used to share the culture, because I was a bit annoyed to be in a target group. So my kids were in a target group, I was in a target group, and you would be a target group. Everybody categorized into target groups, while you would listen to this, and we had this shared culture, and that made also the children's culture very, the children's poems very dark and gloomy. So you would have like a song like, there was a child in the valley that fell into a hole, and in the hole there was a monster. The monster took the child and banged it on the ice, banged it once and banged it twice. And then each verse would be about a body part flying off the child. And you could understand how fun it was to be a child and having this grandmother terrifying you. But then she would wrap everything up with a prayer, something from the 1400s. And so I was kind of really attached to this culture, and I wanted to be a children's book writer. I had this child, and I was reading a children's book for my kid. And I was reading like a thinned out version of Winnie the Pooh. So it wasn't the real Winnie the Pooh. It was like some kind of a target grouped Winnie the Pooh. So Winnie the Pooh, he caught a fish. And the fish looked at Winnie the Pooh and he said, "Don't eat me, Winnie the Pooh." So Winnie the Pooh, he released the fish and roasted a hot dog instead. Because everybody knows a hot dog is not an animal. And the gory subtext, "Where is Piglet?" was not part of that. Wasn't part of the irony. So it was just downright stupid. And so when I started writing my children's book here, The Story of a Blue Planet, I used some influence of these dark old ladies that I was listening to, not going into darkness without a reason, but using some of these elements, because I was also reading like Little Red Riding Hood for my kid. And so she was going through the forest, and then the wolf had locked grandmother in the closet, and then the wolf locked Riding Hood in the closet, And then the hunter came and said, you should not lock them in the closet and pretend to be grandmother in the bed. And so he opens the closet and they all had cookies together. And I was like, no, this is supposed to traumatize my children. He's supposed to eat her and eat Riding Hood. And then they're supposed to fill his stomach with stones. And it's supposed to be horribly, mind-blowingly weird for a child to hear this. But they've taken it away. So I was thrilled with this old culture. And I just started my normal path as a writer. And while doing that, I was always thinking of this and interviewing my grandparents and kind of thinking, just a memory from 1930 is valuable, in the year 2030. It just doesn't matter what it is. So my grandfather, he lost his father at sea when he was 10. So he started working for his family, for a butcher, like or a little store. And for one of his first payments, he bought a camera and had access to all his photos that he was taking since he was a teenager until he became an old man. So he was used at the annual sports games to snap a photo at the finishing line because they didn't have video, like some of you remember. So there was often a dispute of who won the race. So he would snap a photo, he would run home, develop the film, and come back, and they could declare who won the 100-meter race. And you can see the man's chest here is ahead of the other man's foot. So I was just randomly gathering things and looking how a generation kind of lived to see basically all the development and progress and had to create almost everything of the 20th century. They had to make the sports teams, they had to make the sports clubs, the sports stadiums, they had to build the schools, the hospitals. They had challenges like aviation came in, so airplanes were crashing in the highlands of Iceland, and they needed to make the volunteering rescue squad that is still a very big part of the Icelandic culture today, where volunteers go into the highlands and are part of the community. And then what it means to be a woman in times when the world is opening up, and are you allowed to participate or not as a woman? So my grandmother as one of the first women to fly in Iceland. So I was just gathering all these ideas. And then the early days of Icelandic glacial research, which is also in the archives of my grandfather. So all of these things were kind of part of my background and memory, and these were kind of core stories. My uncle with the crocodiles, my grandparents on the glacier, and these stories were kind of a very important kind of part of my identity. And I told you yesterday about grandfather stories in America that operated on Oppenheimer and how he looked exactly like the image of Christ in his childhood church. And so these stories and visits to grandfather in New Jersey and also the lifestyle of my grandfather in the north of Iceland, where they basically lived on everything they ate came from the local vicinity. So I was kind of obsessed with the great change that only happened through one generation. So it's only my father between. So it's me, my father, and my grandfather, and I was like, well, this is so fast. This is so big. So when I started writing my book on time and water, I had before been. So my path was going to be into kind of writing children's books, writing sci-fi, writing inspired by Kurt Vonnegut, Borges, or all these things. But then as a citizen, you're shaped by your local surroundings. You're shaped by the society you live in. You decide something, but then the society decides something else. So my first kind of dilemma was when the greatest nesting place of pink-footed geese in the world was in danger in Iceland. So this area is called Þjórsárver. Icelandic place names are not good to be a virally known name. Þjórsárver. So this is the greatest nesting place of pink-footed geese in the world. So basically a whole species relies on this place. And as I told you, I was writing my children's books and my fantasy and my poetry, but then the greatest nesting place of pink-footed geese in the world is in danger. And I felt like anything that I could create myself was insignificant compared to the greatest nesting place of pink-footed geese in the world. You know, what story could I make? What exhibition, what movie could I write? You know, what could I create as a human that would be as important as this? But the problem, of course, is that this area was going to be drowned for a reservoir that was going to power an aluminum smelter close to Reykjavik. And there you come into issues like employment, economic growth, jobs, profit, corporations, and suddenly megawatts and terawatts and energy prices and clean energy versus coal, etc. And suddenly I was kind of drawn into these more political, complex issues. So instead of going into fantasy, I was totally occupied by this fact that we in the year 2000 were going to destroy so many beautiful areas in Iceland. So I started to do some research on this and what plans our government at the time had. And there I started kind of to be confronted with terms that would be scientific or technological. So what do you say? What does it mean when the government produces a brochure and says economically harnessable hydropower with relatively little environmental impact is estimated at 30 terawatt hours a year? So to put it in context, the Icelandic nation, to run a fully thriving modern society, needs about 3 terawatt hours of energy. So they were talking about selling about 27 terawatt hours to heavy industry. And basically there's no industry in the world that needs a whole terawatt hour. There are very few industries, not even if you make a manufacturing company, a printing company, it's almost only aluminum that uses a whole terawatt hour or even 5 terawatt hours of energy, or at the time. So basically, the only way to harness the rivers of Iceland was to attract aluminum producers to Iceland. And they said it was without damaging the environment. So Iceland had been harnessed a bit for our needs, but also for one smelter that was built in the 60s. So I decided, okay, I'm just going to be stupid here. I'm going to be a child, and I'm just going to ask, how many rivers are 30 terawatt hours? Because behind 30 terawatt hours are, of course, waterfalls and rivers, but most people would just take this for granted. Just, okay, they take the number 30 terawatt hours, and they believe, okay, so this must be a rational conclusion of some rational institution through some kind of an academic process. But when I counted the rivers, because they've been measured and mapped, and I found out that understanding terawatt hours is not so difficult after all. It's not like a logarithmic scale or something. It's basically 1 plus 2 plus 0.7 plus 2.5. You know, it's basically 2 plus 2, almost kindergarten math that you could use. So to harness 30 terawatt hours, we needed to dam not only every river in Iceland, but a little bit more than every river in Iceland. And suddenly it dawned upon me that there was some kind of a cultural problem with our good engineers, which would be many of my father's classmates, good, sturdy citizens of Iceland. But why, if you studied something and you learned something and you knew something, why did you, yes, you had already served the need of the economy. We all had like plenty of energy in our grid. But why did you want to take all the rivers and sell them to aluminum smelters? I could understand if you wanted to take like one river every 20, 30 years to see how the world is developing or to minimize the risk. But why did they want to take all the rivers? And this was just so mind-blowing for me that it took about 10 years of my time to write the book Dreamland, a self-help manual for a frightened nation, and then the film from that, to kind of confront this ideology, because they were building these huge dams, and even though it's clean energy in a way, it is still hugely disruptive for habitats of reindeer and geese, and also it affects the ocean. So through this work, through this kind of local environmental work, this is an area that is now under 200 meters of water in Iceland. So if you come, you can't see this area, but there is beauty left. I'm not saying it's all gone, but this very important area was lost. And what I found out when we were exploring this, and so we went into this area to photograph and to witness and to kind of spread the kind of beauty of this area, to make people aware that under something they called 5 terawatt hours was something that was of great significance and beauty. So it was interesting also for me to encounter language. So we live in many languages. That is, when we were trying to argue for the area, I could not say it was beautiful. I could not say it was important for the birds, but I had to say it might be good for tourism, or it might be good for the brand of Iceland, or we could use this as a backdrop for a new Star Wars movie. So I had to prove some kind of economic benefit of the area to prove that it was worth saving, and it was actually worth something. And it was like we were totally detached from nature as humans. That is, we could only explain nature from the use it could give us. And so I would go on a TV show and I would say, oh, the geese, they are beautiful, they're magnificent. It's our responsibility to preserve them. But then in the stone paper scissor, in the rock scissor, whatever, in that game, beauty would always lose. So you say biodiversity, they say economic growth. You say beauty, they say jobs. You say holy, they say money. So I stumbled upon a book that was traveling this area in the 1950s, and the author of the book, so I write about it here in my book Time and Water. So he describes the area with a language that was just out of all proportions. So it's very difficult to even describe, even to translate that language. So in the 1930s, in 1939, this Icelandic poet was traveling this same area. The wild highlands are a wide embrace, mountain blue. Their stillness quietens you, listening. Fascinated, you attend to your own soul's breath, this essence you've forgotten about for years. It's here you first perceive your spirit's immeasurable expanse, and you stand still and astounded in the deep silence amid unspeakable reverence for your soul's divinity. The distance, the mountain bluing, the great glacier's dome, the weighty murmurations of silence, all this is reflected and echoed beneath your soul's vault, spanning heaven and earth, your spirit's wide horizon. You're moved to tears, resonant as a tremulous bell in the pregnant silence of God's vast expanse, becoming one with it. So if I had been in a TV interview and said, well, I vibrate like a tremulous bell in God's great expanse when I'm there, I would not win the stone scissor game. So while I was working on this, I got to know lots of scientists and biologists, and I started kind of interacting with them and kind of understanding their struggle. So a biologist could come into that region, and even though he would feel this, what this writer was feeling, the biologist could not express that in that area. He had just had to count the flowers, count the birds, count the rock formations, put that in an Excel sheet, compare that to an extinction list in some international survey that would be sent to some other institution. They would weigh that against some economist that would weigh the economic benefits. So it was also alienated and kind of dehumanizing. So the biologists could not just say, this is sacred. And we could not just say, even though you felt the area was sacred, when you were treading on this blue moss with these eggs, you could not say it's holy. So I was wondering, how rational is our world when we have, like in every culture all over the world, there was something holy in nature. Holy, maybe because of practical reasons of preserving waterfronts or something, or nesting grounds, but there was always something holy. But why could we not say anything was holy in nature anymore? Unless it was a national park, which actually has more the role of a theme park of tourist attraction. So why could we not just take something aside and say, oh, we're not touching this. This is just out of our range. This is just above us. So not that I'm preaching that we should see things as holy, but actually in hindsight, if we had not been so rational and we had seen like at least 30% of the rivers and the forests to be holy, we would not be meeting this ecological crisis that we're faced with today. Because some primitive people said, don't go in there. If you destroy that, something terrible will happen. But we went in with our meter stick and no, I can't see anything. We can chop this down and nothing terrible happened. But with 1,000 incidents of that, things are happening. So what I'm kind of looking at in my book is also this kind of what language is appropriate when you're faced with this big ecological crisis. That is, we have lots of languages. So now we have like this liberal, you could say democratic language of the 20th century, economic freedom. I'm not gonna. And then we have in China maybe some other language. In Saudi Arabia we have some other language. But what language is appropriate when it comes to an issue that is just confronting the sole existence of humans? Is it green? Is it green products, or is it what language should we use? So I was working with these scientists, and I'm gonna skip a few slides here. So I was working with scientists, and I was talking to the scientist that is kind of one of the leading scientists behind a word like this: ocean acidification. So this is the biggest word in the world. I'm exaggerating, not, because the ocean is like 70% of the Earth's surface. So this word was created around 2004 in a convention in Portugal, if I remember correctly. It was first mentioned in Icelandic media in the year 2006. And this word is about one of the biggest, it's about kind of the chemical that is global. It's you could call it global warming's evil twin. That is, global warming is about the, and you can fix me if I'm wrong. It's about kind of the physical element of CO2. That is the element of capturing heat that enters the planet. So trapping heat, the heat trapping element of CO2. While ocean acidification is more about the chemical element of CO2 going into the waters. I know these terms better in Icelandic than in English. So it's about CO2 saturated into the waters and changing the pH. So this is an event that is so huge that it's, like I said, it's bigger than language. We pretend that we understand it when we see a graph like this. We have the illusion of understanding it in some shallow intellectual way, but we don't understand it in this kind of deep existential way that we should actually understand it. We don't feel it like to the core. And I might almost argue that climate anxiety is actually a very rational response to this data, that living in a world where you understand it, but the world is not responding to it. So it's almost like if you're in a car with somebody in a bus and the bus driver is going off the cliff and somebody's screaming in the back row and you say, oh, you have like this backseat anxiety. No, it doesn't have backseat anxiety. He's just freaking out because the driver is driving off the cliff. And if the driver stops driving off the cliff or does something, then you don't have the same anxiety anymore. The anxiety is the mismatch of the world you live in versus your knowledge versus where the world is heading. So this is the biggest world in the world, because the outcome of this, if the world oceans drop to 7.7 or 7.8 while they are warming, is what is also called sometimes the great mass extinction. This is the end of coral reefs. This might break the food chain in many places, and this will change the aragonite saturation in the oceans to be an ocean that goes from being undersaturated or oversaturated of aragonite, which is the building material of shell building animals, to becoming an ocean that is undersaturated. So all of these graphs are a paradigm shift. So this is not just, this is scientific knowledge that is very recent. And recent, we could even talk about the last 50 years. But in the word ocean acidification, that word is less than maybe 15 years old. So I met the scientists. So we all know the Keeling curve, don't you? The Keeling curve of CO2 in the atmosphere. This curve is the opposite curve, the hockey stick in the ocean, where the pH level is going the opposite direction. So the challenge of writing the book is that I can't just put myself on a high horse and say, you fellow people, I know everything about ocean acidification. I will explain it vaguely for you. I will take the science and explain it, but it's much different from that, because even the scientist doesn't understand it, if you get what I mean. So the scientist mirrors himself against society, and he kind of balances himself against everybody else, because otherwise he'll just be running up and down the street screaming and everybody would just lock him away. He would not be credible. So my role is not only explaining things, like taking science and explaining it in a more simple language. It's more about taking the science and explaining, or trying to explain to myself and my fellow citizens, like what this means. And so I would say, like I don't see myself when I'm writing this book as a derivative of simplifying science for a non-scientific reader. I see myself as much as explaining the science the scientist found to him, and putting that in a context of what this means, because this means we're in a paradigm shift, and that it means that everything that we've been doing for the last 100 years, I think with good intentions, I think every generation has been struggling to leave a better world for their children than they were born in. Bigger schools, better roads, bridges, power, energy, food, and I think we have accomplished that, or people have accomplished that in many ways. But then something comes like on the side, and it says, oh, I'm sorry, but many of your good intentions were calculated upon the wrong premises. You forgot something very important in your calculation. So this means that so this is a paradigm shift, but the problem is that, and this is happening on a timeline, and like I was talking about yesterday, what does 2100 mean for us? Why is 2100 culturally meaningless? So it's not about just presenting the data and saying blatantly 2100. It's also asking, why is 2100 culturally meaningless in our world? So maybe because the year 2000 was so culturally embedded that I think no date except 1969 has been embedded so fiercely as a milestone in our collective consciousness, that I think the result of that embedding of the year 2000 is that we still feel like 2050 is after 50 years. Or if we don't think that, I think we at least all agree that 2100 is after 100 years. But it's actually only after 77 years. So this is a paradigm shift, and I will and then what is happening on the same timeline with the glaciers? Sorry for skipping all this. So what is happening to the glaciers on the same timeline? So if it was only happening to the ocean, it would be a paradigm shift. But on the same timeline, the glaciers are vanishing on the same speed. So you would think sometimes that the ocean pH would react on a 10,000 year scale, while the glaciers would react on a different scale. But this actually means that almost all elements of water on our planet are going out of balance simultaneously. And that is a paradigm shift of a dimension that we have never experienced. So it means basically the ocean, the sea level, the glaciers, the groundwater, the rain, the snow, the ice, the permafrost, just every single element of water that we have aligned ourselves with and lived upon for the last 6,000 years, or at least the last 200 years, is going out of balance simultaneously. And for some strange reason, it's in front of us, it's happening. We have the science, we have the information, we have the media, we have all the tools to understand this and align our systems and our inventions and our resources to prevent this, or at least minimize the outcome. But it's like these machines that we've created have their own life and their own will, and sometimes in the terms of mythology, like we remember when Moses split the Red Sea 3,000 years ago. But we only remember Moses as the character, but we don't know about all the hundreds of people that were around during that time that maybe had great contributions to that story. Who will be like the tragic human leader after 3,000 years that stood here, knew everything, had all the information, knew all the people that were making all these machines? He could call them all and ask them to turn the machine the other way, or turn off the machine for a while they would be reinventing another way. Who will be the tragic leader that just thought he was the pinnacle of humanity, created everything, all these wonderful inventions, but in the end, these inventions had their own agenda and just continued until catastrophe hit us. So that is the big challenge. And how can we update us from 2000 to like really connecting to 2160? Like I was telling you yesterday, I took my daughter to my grandmother's house, and we calculated, when is someone still alive that my daughter will love? So my grandmother was born 1924, she became 98 years old. My daughter, 2008. If she becomes as old as grandmother, she would still be alive and kicking in the year 2100. And maybe she would be sitting in this same kitchen. Maybe she will renovate the same house. And maybe a 20-year-old would come for a visit, not even a 12-year-old, but like a fully mature human being, like starting to live her or his life. And we calculated, when is that person still remembering my daughter as her greatest influence in life? And she comes up with the year 2170 if that person becomes 90. So my grandmother whispered a secret to my daughter. She promises to tell nobody this secret until the year 2100, and is asking that person to make a promise, don't tell anybody until 2170. So in the year 2020, they could make a promise of something to happen in the year 2170 without writing anything down, just through the transmission of one single human, which would be my daughter. So thank you very much.
So please come up to the microphone. Don't touch it. Just come near the microphone and ask your questions. And Dr. Cameraman will monitor the chat box, and we'll ask Andri to answer questions. Thank you.
Well, you're amazing, because how you can do this in a language that's not your own with stuff that's almost impossible to communicate is just incredible. So you have to come back next year for week 8 water, and you need to be in the big amp.
Thank you.
So your presentation is very timely in a sense. There was an article in the Times Magazine this past week about, it's not my fault. It's my fault. You want me to swallow it?
Just go a bit closer.
Okay, here we go again. So there was an article in the New York Times Magazine this past weekend called Forever Chemicals. And the story is about PFAS, chemicals in the water that go up the food chain. And the gentleman who's been doing the research is from Greenland, a neighbor of yours. And he has been documenting over a period of time, and the way he's documented it is somewhat similar to the way you're talking about passing messages along. What he's done is he has had individuals who have volunteered to, as they give birth, to have umbilical blood from the child and the mother, and he has tracked them over the past 40 years. And what he has found is that the acidic invasion in the water has gone up the food chain and has already affected the children over these past years. And as a result, he's continuing it, but it is a story that has legs in terms of longevity of it, and it's something that if you haven't looked into, might be of interest to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I would ask a question. I didn't understand the word that you used to describe the acidification, the chemical that you talked about.
Aragonite.
Yeah, do we have a is there a
It's a version. It's a what do you call it? It's calcium carbonate. It's basically calcium carbonate. It's the material of coral reefs. So and that's also I actually didn't know this word until the scientist told me, and I don't see it in the media. So it might even be easier just to call it calcium carbonate, because aragonite is calcium carbonate in a slightly different form.
I did find what your talk really fascinating, because and so relevant, because it's about basically how you motivate people to do something. And one of the big issues constantly in climate change, I'm 65, so I remember first hearing about it in 1986. And then there was a huge world conference in 1990, or there was an agreement to try and keep the levels of CO2 emissions at a 1990 level, like 30 odd years ago. And that sense of time, so you keep thinking, well, yes, we have to do something about climate change, but right now we have to focus more on the immediate, the pandemic or the war in the Ukraine, or so it keeps getting pushed off because it's further in the future.
Could you ask a question, please?
Just, how, I know you were just at the beginnings of sort of thinking it through, but how would you suggest the first steps should happen in terms of getting people to politically, or getting the politics of it so that there's a focus on an immediate change? Like there's a need to do something now in very, very real terms, but we keep delaying and delaying. And the reality of what we have to do gets denied.
Yeah.
How would you say, what?
I'm going to get another question because I might combine them.
Oh, my question relates to your daughter and how you perceive what she perceives about your work and what's ahead of her.
Well, I actually, I'm not pestering my children too much. That is, I'm not expecting them to be the new Greta Thunbergs of Iceland. So I'm kind of letting my kids to find their own way. I'm not like demanding them to be, I'm just kind of allowing them to blend in. And so they, of course, are very aware of these things just through the presence of family talks. She just went through an archaeological dig up East Iceland and she found a ring from the year 1000. But she's only 15, but she's already caught the sense of time at least. So she might go into archaeology, but I'm not trying to push things too heavily upon them.
I'll be brief. I really don't have a question, but I want to honor you for being here today with us and yesterday. And also in Iceland, I was on the first academic tour that Mark Wensler led. And you have a beautiful country. I'm so sad these things are happening to you as they are to the rest of us. So please come back again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Have you seen any impact yet from your work on people's behavior changing?
Well, it's very hard to directly measure one's impact. You know, I know, for example, that I did the memorial for the Oak Glacier, and which was the first glacier Iceland loses to climate change. And I know that the mayor of LA used those words as his final words when he was addressing the C50, which are the 50 biggest megacities in the world. And he was using those words as a whip on them to start some kind of action, which is, this memorial acknowledges that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it.
How are the fossil fuels being fought in Iceland? Are you getting on top of that with electric vehicles and all that kind of thing?
Yes, but Iceland Iceland has like almost all the electricity in Iceland is local and geothermal or hydro, and the heavy industry uses a lot. So we could easily electrify all the vehicles. But the problem is that we're an island and we're quite dependent on flying. So they need to develop some kind of a synthetic fuel to be able to. But to answer your question about action, we haven't yet kind of gone into, so we're still pretending that the paradigm of the last 30 years, of economic paradigm of the last 30 years, will solve the issue, like by slowly getting an electronic car, like without disruption. I think it's inevitable that we will have to experience like 5 years of something like COVID. But the good thing is that you can still hug your grandmother while you're fighting climate change. So it should not be as painful as COVID actually, because it would be much more about community, about people being close together. I think places like this could serve, an excellent role through a transition period when we just painfully need to shut certain things off. And I also think that we haven't explored, like I was showing you the pictures of the rescue squad that was saving the airplanes. We haven't explored volunteering. We haven't explored why is it normal to draft 1 million young men and send them to a war, but not draft you for half a year and fix something or plant something or retrofit something, or why can't we just put me in a pink uniform and make solar panels for a year or something, or heat pumps, or so we haven't explored any of these mobility kind of paradigms that we have. We have monks where you seek the highest, like the church has monks and nuns, where your highest virtue comes through the greatest scarcity. Maybe for 5 years we have to seek our highest virtue through the greatest scarcity, and just do with poetry and entertaining each other for 5 years. So I'm saying, like, we have to have some kind of a disruption. We have to disrupt the society in some way. That is, take the most damaging things and turn them down by hand, and just acknowledge that, okay, maybe carbon capture can do something, but also just by stop burning things. I calculated the fire that humans have created, because we have this volcano in Iceland. The emissions of that volcano was 150,000 tons per day. This eruption that Eyjafjallajökull, it closed off the airspace for a week. So Eyjafjallajökull was only going on for like 2 weeks, and the emissions were like 150,000 tons per day. The emissions of humans from the fires that we have in our engines and our factories are 100 million tons per day. So if you divide 100 million with 150,000, you get the magic number 666. So human emissions are like 666 of these volcanoes, not for 2 weeks, but decade after decade after decade. And if you talk to any geologist and ask them, when did the Earth have 600 of these volcanoes erupting for 50 or 100 years? He will just do this and point at some layer in the Grand Canyon and say that's when things really went out of hand. So that is what is happening now, and we have to just face this paradigm shift and do it gracefully and in harmony. It's not easy. Lots of people lose money in jobs, purpose, but it's also a transition of finding new purpose and new jobs and new activity for so many of us, and just doing things differently. So thank you very much.
Thank you.